The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Richard Harrington's mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. At 58, Richard had everything money could buy: a sprawling estate in the most exclusive neighborhood, a collection of vintage cars, and investments that seemed to multiply by themselves. But the one thing his wealth couldn't replace was his late wife, Eleanor, whose absence still haunted the empty halls even 5 years after her passing. Richard adjusted his silk tie as he stood before the mirror in his master's suite. Today marked another important merger for Harrington Enterprises, and appearances mattered. His fingers reached for the antique wooden box on his dresser. Inside was the diamond-studded tie pin Eleanor had given him on their 20th anniversary. It had become his lucky charm for important business meetings. Strange, he muttered to himself, noticing the box was slightly ajar. Richard was meticulous about his possessions. Everything had its place. He opened the box fully, relieved to find the tie pin nestled in its velvet cushion, but something else nagged at him. Something wasn't right. His eyes darted to the painting on the far wall, behind which was concealed his personal safe. Richard crossed the room in quick strides and swung the painting aside. The safe appeared untouched, but a sense of unease washed over him. He punched in the combination, Eleanor's birthday, and pulled open the heavy door. Richard's heart skipped a beat. The small velvet pouch that contained Eleanor's diamond earrings, the ones he'd given her on their first anniversary, was missing from its usual spot. He frantically searched through the safe's contents, pushing aside documents and jewelry boxes, but the earrings were nowhere to be found. "This can't be happening," he whispered, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Richard reached for his phone and pulled up the security app. His home was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance, with cameras monitoring every entrance and hallway. He scrolled through the morning's footage until he found what he was looking for: the hallway outside his bedroom. The footage showed Esther Williams, his housekeeper of 15 years, entering his room at 7:30 that morning, carrying fresh towels and bed linens. She left 20 minutes later. No one else had entered or exited his room since then. Richard's jaw tightened. Esther had been with the family since before Eleanor's illness. She had helped care for Eleanor in her final months, and afterward, she'd become something of a constant presence in the big empty house. Richard had always trusted her implicitly. She had keys to every room, knew all the family routines, and had access to areas even other staff members didn't. But the evidence seemed clear. Only Esther had been in his room that morning. Only Esther could have taken the earrings. Richard paced the room, his mind racing. The earrings were valued at over $50,000, but their sentimental worth was priceless. They were one of the few things he had left that connected him to Eleanor. He picked up his phone again and called his head of security. "Thomas, I need you to come to the master suite immediately," Richard said, his voice tight. "And find Mrs. Williams. Tell her to meet me in my study in 10 minutes. While waiting, Richard reviewed the security footage again. There was Esther entering his room with an armful of linens. The camera angle didn't show the safe directly, but it caught a partial reflection in the mirror, enough to see Esther standing near the painting that concealed it. The footage wasn't conclusive, but it fueled Richard's suspicions. Thomas knocked and entered the room. "You wanted to see me, sir?" "The diamond earrings that belonged to Mrs. Harrington are missing from the safe," Richard said, pointing to the open safe. "I need to know who took them." Thomas frowned. "Has anyone else been in the room today, sir?" "Just Esther, according to the security footage," Richard replied, showing Thomas his phone. "She was here this morning." Thomas studied the footage. "It's not clear if she's actually opening the safe, sir." "Who else could it be?" "Nobody else has been in here," Richard snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Those earrings are worth a small fortune." "Mrs. Williams has been with your family for 15 years, sir," Thomas reminded him gently. "She's always been trustworthy." Richard waved away the comment. "Everyone has a breaking point, Thomas. 15 years is a long time to wait for a big score." The words tasted bitter even as he said them, but the missing earrings and the security footage seemed too coincidental. "I'll speak with her right away." "Sir," Thomas said, his expression professional but troubled. Richard made his way down to his study, a richly appointed room with leather-bound books lining the walls and a massive mahogany desk that had once belonged to his father. He settled into his chair, trying to collect his thoughts before confronting Esther. The knock on the door came precisely 10 minutes later. "Come in," Richard called. Esther Williams entered the study. At 62, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore the simple black uniform with white collar that was standard for the household staff, perfectly pressed as always. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Harrington?" Her voice was calm, respectful, the same tone she'd used for 15 years. "Close the door." "Esther," Richard said, not bothering to mask the coldness in his voice. She did as instructed, then stood before his desk, hands clasped in front of her. "I've just discovered that my late wife's diamond earrings are missing from my bedroom safe," Richard said, watching her face closely for any reaction. "You were the only person in my room this morning." Esther's expression shifted from neutral to confused. "Sir, the security cameras show you entering my room at 7:30 and leaving 20 minutes later. No one else went in or out." Esther's brow furrowed. "Yes, I brought fresh towels and changed the bed linens as I do every Tuesday." "And did you happen to open my safe while you were there?" Richard asked, his voice rising slightly. Esther's eyes widened. "Mr. Harrington, I would never—" "Never what? Never take something that doesn't belong to you? Never betray my trust?" Richard stood up, his hands flat on the desk. "Those earrings are worth $50,000, Esther. That's more than you make in a year." Esther took a step back, her face registering shock and hurt. "Sir, I have never taken anything from this house. Not in 15 years. "Then explain to me how the earrings disappeared this morning when you were the only person in that room," Richard demanded, his voice echoing in the large study. By now, Thomas had entered the room, standing quietly by the door. From the hallway, Richard could see other staff members hovering, drawn by the raised voices. "I didn't take your earrings, Mr. Harrington," Esther said, her voice steady despite the accusation. "I would never do such a thing." Richard's frustration mounted. "I want my property returned, Esther. If the earrings find their way back to the safe, perhaps we can forget this unfortunate incident." "There's nothing to return because I took nothing," Esther insisted, her dignity intact despite the public humiliation. "I've helped raise your children after Mrs. Harrington passed. I've cared for this house and your family for 15 years. Which makes this betrayal all the worse," Richard said coldly. "Thomas, please escort Mrs. Williams to her quarters. I want her belongings searched." Gasps came from the staff watching from the hallway. Esther's face paled, but she held her head high. "Mr. Harrington," Thomas began hesitantly. "Perhaps we should—" "Now, Thomas," Richard cut him off. Esther looked directly at Richard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "In all my years of service to this family, I have never been treated with such disrespect. Mrs. Harrington would be ashamed of how you're behaving right now." The mention of Eleanor struck Richard like a physical blow, but he refused to back down. His precious connection to his wife was missing, and someone had to be responsible. As Thomas reluctantly approached Esther, the other staff members exchanged troubled glances. Esther had mentored many of them, showing them the ropes when they first joined the household. They respected her, trusted her, and now they watched as their employer publicly accused her of theft. "This way, Mrs. Williams," Thomas said quietly. Gesturing toward the door, Esther turned to follow, her back straight, her dignity intact despite the accusation that threatened to destroy her reputation and livelihood. Richard remained standing behind his desk, conflicting emotions churning inside him. Was he making a terrible mistake? Or had Esther finally revealed her true colors after all these years? The security footage didn't lie. She had been the only one in his room. The earrings were gone. The conclusion seemed obvious. Yet as he watched Esther walk away with Thomas, a tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. 15 years of loyal service against one missing item, but the evidence seemed clear, and Richard Harrington had built his fortune on making hard decisions based on the facts before him. "I want those earrings found," he called after them, ignoring the disapproving looks from the other staff members as they dispersed back to their duties. Little did Richard know that the next 10 minutes would change everything he thought he knew about the situation and force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself that he'd rather leave unexamined. The walk to Esther's quarters felt like the longest journey of her life. For 15 years she had moved through this mansion with confidence and purpose. Now with Thomas at her side and Richard's accusation hanging in the air, each step felt heavy with injustice. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry about this. I don't believe— It's all right, Thomas, Esther said quietly. You're just doing your job. They reached the small but comfortable apartment in the East Wing that had been Esther's home for a decade and a half. Unlike the temporary staff who lived off property, Esther had been offered permanent quarters after Eleanor fell ill. I need you close by, Eleanor had insisted, her voice already weakened by the cancer that would eventually take her life. You're the only one who knows how to run this house properly. Esther unlocked her door, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The space was modestly furnished but filled with personal touches. Family photos, handmade quilts, and books carefully arranged on shelves. It was a sanctuary she had never imagined would be violated like this. I need to search your belongings, Thomas said, his discomfort evident. Mr. Harrington's orders. Esther nodded, her face a mask of dignity. Do what you must. As Thomas began his reluctant search, checking drawers and closets, Esther sat on the edge of her bed. Her mind raced back through the morning, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had indeed entered Richard's room at 7:30 a.m., as was her routine every Tuesday. She'd changed the linens, replaced the towels, and dusted the surfaces. The safe, she remembered suddenly. It wasn't completely closed. Thomas paused his search. What do you mean? When I was dusting near the painting, I noticed it wasn't hanging straight. I adjusted it and saw that the safe door was slightly ajar, Esther explained. I closed it properly. I thought Mr. Harrington must have been in a hurry and forgotten to secure it. Thomas frowned. Did you look inside? Of course not, Esther replied firmly. That would be overstepping. I simply pushed it closed and made sure the painting was straight. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Thomas nodded slowly. That might explain why the cameras caught you near the safe. He hesitated, then added, but it doesn't explain the missing earrings. Because I didn't take them, Esther said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Thomas opened it to find Maria, the younger housekeeper who had been trained by Esther when she joined the staff 3 years ago. Mr. Harrington wants everyone in the main hall, Maria said, her eyes darting nervously to Esther. Right away. Esther stood, smoothing her uniform. Has he found the earrings? I don't know, Maria admitted, but something's happening. He looks different. The three made their way to the main hall where the rest of the household staff had already gathered. Richard stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his face unreadable. Beside him stood a security officer whom Esther didn't recognize, holding a tablet. Mrs. Williams, Richard called as she entered the hall. Step forward, please. Esther moved to the center of the room, aware of all eyes upon her. The other staff members, the cook, the gardeners, the drivers, and the cleaners, watched with varying expressions of concern and disbelief. Many had worked alongside Esther for years, trusting her judgment and following her example. Mrs. Williams, you continue to deny taking the diamond earrings from my safe, Richard asked, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged hall. Yes, sir. I did not take them. Esther's voice was clear and unwavering. Richard nodded to the security officer who tapped the tablet screen. We've reviewed the security footage more carefully, Richard announced. And there's something I need everyone to see. The large screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, showing the footage from outside Richard's bedroom that morning. They all watched as Esther entered with the linens, then as she left 20 minutes later. Now, said Richard, we'll view the footage from inside the room. Esther felt a chill. She hadn't known there were cameras inside the bedrooms. The screen changed to show Richard's bedroom from an angle near the ceiling. Esther could be seen making the bed, replacing towels and dusting surfaces, all normal parts of her routine. Then, the footage showed her approaching the painting, adjusting it, and noticing the safe. Just as she had told Thomas, she simply closed it and straightened the painting before continuing with her work. The camera angle changes when she approaches the painting, the security officer explained. We can see this reflection in the mirror. The footage zoomed in on the mirror's reflection, showing Esther closing the safe door without looking inside. There's more, Richard said, his tone different now, less accusatory. This is footage from earlier this morning at 6:15 a.m. The screen showed Richard himself, entering his bedroom in a bathrobe after his morning shower. He went to the safe, opened it, and appeared to be looking for something. After a moment, he closed the safe, but the footage clearly showed that the door didn't latch properly. A murmur ran through the gathered staff. Richard raised a hand for silence. "Mrs. Williams," he said, turning to Esther. "Did you tell anyone that you found my safe unlocked this morning?" "Only Thomas just now when he was searching my quarters." Esther's voice remained steady, but her eyes held a question. Richard turned to the security officer again. "Show them the footage from the East Wing corridor at 7:15 this morning." The screen changed to show a hallway leading to the family bedrooms. A slender figure moved quickly along the corridor, glancing around as if to ensure no one was watching. The image was slightly blurry, but it was clearly a young woman with long dark hair. Gasps and whispers filled the hall. Esther's hand went to her mouth in surprise. "Is that—" someone began. "Yes," Richard said heavily. "That's my daughter, Catherine." The footage continued, showing Catherine entering Richard's bedroom, going directly to the safe, and removing something small that she quickly tucked into her pocket before hurrying out. The silence in the hall was absolute. Esther felt a rush of emotions, relief that her innocence was proven, sadness for Richard's embarrassment, and concern for Catherine, who had clearly been trying to keep her actions secret. Richard turned to face Esther, his expression completely transformed from earlier. The cold suspicion was gone, replaced by something like shame. "Mrs. Williams," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "Esther, it appears I've made a terrible mistake." Esther remained silent, her dignity intact despite the ordeal she'd been put through. "Thomas," Richard said, turning to his head of security, "has the search of Mrs. Williams' quarters been completed?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "Nothing was found as I expected." Richard nodded, then addressed the entire staff. "I owe Mrs. Williams an apology, and I owe all of you an explanation. It seems my daughter took the earrings without my knowledge. The fact that I immediately suspected Mrs. Williams, despite her 15 years of loyal service to this family." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The staff exchanged glances. The unspoken question hung in the air. Why had Richard so quickly suspected Esther, when his own daughter had far more opportunity, and as they all knew, a history of taking things without permission? "Everyone is dismissed," Richard said finally. "Mrs. Williams, would you please remain? I'd like to speak with you privately." As the staff dispersed, their whispered conversations filling the hall, Esther stood her ground. She'd been publicly accused. She deserved a public apology. "Mr. Harrington," she said once they were alone, her voice quiet but firm, "I have worked in this house since before your children were teenagers. I helped your wife through her illness. I've seen this family through its darkest days and its brightest moments." Richard looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I know, Esther. That's what makes my behavior inexcusable. When Mrs. Harrington was dying," Esther continued, "she asked me to promise to look after you and the children, to keep this home running as she would have wanted. I've honored that promise every day for 5 years." Richard's shoulders slumped. "And this is how I repaid that loyalty." "The question is," Esther said, finally allowing a hint of her hurt to show, "why was I your first suspect? What made you so quick to believe I would betray you after all these years?" It was a question Richard wasn't prepared to answer, one that would force him to examine assumptions he'd never acknowledged, even to himself. But as he stood before this woman whose integrity he'd questioned so easily, he knew he couldn't avoid the uncomfortable truth much longer. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I need to figure it out. Because you're right, you deserved better from me. Much better." Esther nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We both loved her, Mr. Harrington. Eleanor would want us to be honest with each other, especially now." As Richard struggled to form a response, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the hall. Footsteps approached, quick, light, and familiar. Catherine had come home, and neither Richard nor Esther was prepared for the conversation that would follow. Catherine Harrington stepped into the main hall, a vision of youth and privilege in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater. At 20, she was the spitting image of her mother. The same chestnut hair, the same delicate features, the same confident stride. But there was something else in her expression today, something that made her look younger than her years. Worry. "Dad?" she called, her voice echoing in the vast space. "What's going on? Why was everyone gathered in here? I saw them all leaving as I came in." Richard and Esther turned toward her, their faces revealing everything Catherine needed to know. Her father's expression was a mixture of relief and disappointment. while Esther's usual warmth was replaced with a careful neutrality that Catherine had never seen before. "Oh," Catherine said softly, her hand instinctively moving to her pocket. Know what exactly?" Richard asked, his voice controlled but tight. "That you took your mother's diamond earrings without asking? That you snuck into my room this morning, opened the safe, and helped yourself to something that wasn't yours to take?" Catherine's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Security cameras," Richard interrupted, gesturing toward the screen that still showed the frozen image of Catherine at his bedroom door. "What I don't understand is why you didn't just ask me." Catherine looked down, her confidence evaporating. "I tried to text you this morning, but you didn't answer. I knew you had that big meeting today and I didn't want to bother you. So instead you decided to help yourself to your mother's jewelry?" Richard's voice rose slightly. "Do you have any idea what you've caused?" Catherine's eyes darted to Esther, then back to her father. "What do you mean?" "I was going to return them tonight. I just wanted to wear them for—" "I accused Esther of stealing them," Richard cut in, the words coming out sharply. "I had her quarters searched. I humiliated her in front of the entire staff." The color drained from Catherine's face. "You what?" she whispered, looking at Esther with horror. "Oh my God, Esther, I'm so sorry. I never thought—" "No, you didn't think," Richard said, his anger now directed at himself as much as at his daughter. "And neither did I." Esther remained silent, her hands clasped in front of her, the perfect picture of composure despite being at the center of this family drama. Catherine pulled something from her pocket, a small velvet pouch. "I was going to put them back tonight," she said, her voice small. "I just wanted to wear them for my presentation today. It's a big deal, and I thought Mom would want me to have them." Richard's expression softened slightly. "What presentation?" "For my business ethics class," Catherine explained. "We had to present on a company we admire, and I chose Mom's foundation. I wanted to feel close to her today." Tears welled in her eyes. "I should have asked, but you've been so busy lately, and every time I bring up Mom, you change the subject." Richard looked stricken. It was true. He had avoided talking about Eleanor, finding the memories too painful even 5 years later. "That still doesn't excuse taking them without permission," he said. But his tone had lost its edge. "Or not telling me about this presentation? I would have wanted to know about that. Would you?" Catherine challenged, a hint of her mother's spirit flashing in her eyes. "You've buried yourself in work since Mom died. Half the time you don't even know what city I'm in, let alone what's happening in my life." The accusation hung in the air between them, painfully accurate. Richard had indeed retreated into his work after Eleanor's death, leaving his daughter to navigate her grief largely alone. It was Esther who had stepped in, providing the emotional support and daily guidance that Catherine needed. Esther finally broke her silence. "Perhaps this is a conversation that should continue privately," she suggested gently. "I should return to my duties." "No," Richard said firmly. "You're owed an explanation and an apology from both of us." He turned to his daughter. "Catherine, the earrings were missing, and the security footage showed Esther was the only one who had entered my room this morning. At least that's what I thought until we reviewed all the footage." "So you immediately assumed she stole them?" Catherine asked, appalled. "Esther, who's been with us forever, who took care of Mom when she was sick, who practically raised me after Mom died." Richard flinched at his daughter's words. "Yes," he admitted. "That's exactly what I did. But why?" Catherine pressed. "Why would you think that?" It was the same question Esther had asked, the one Richard had been unable to answer. But now, confronted by both women, he couldn't avoid it any longer. "I don't know," he began, then stopped himself. "No, that's not true. I do know, but I've never had to face it before." He took a deep breath. When something valuable goes missing and a person of lesser means has access to it, it's easy to jump to conclusions. It's wrong, but it's easy. "You mean because Esther works for us? Because she doesn't have as much money as we do?" Catherine asked, still not fully understanding. Richard hesitated, then nodded. "That's part of it. What's the other part?" Catherine pushed. Richard looked at Esther, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as a fixture in his home, not as a role, but as a person, a woman who had given 15 years of her life to his family. "I think we both know the answer to that," he said quietly. Esther held his gaze, her dignity never wavering. "Yes," she said simply. "I believe we do." Catherine looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding, then to shame. Dad, that's awful. Yes, Richard agreed. It is awful. And until today, I would have denied that I could ever think that way. I would have insisted that I don't see color, that I treat everyone the same. He shook his head. But my actions tell a different story, don't they? No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of this realization settling over them all. It was Catherine who finally broke the silence, stepping forward to hand the velvet pouch to her father. I really am sorry, she said, about the earrings and about what happened because I took them. Richard accepted the pouch, feeling the small weight of the diamond earrings inside. These meant so much to your mother, he said softly. She wore them the day you were born. Catherine's eyes filled with tears again. I didn't know that. There's a lot about her that you don't know, Richard admitted. Because I haven't been willing to talk about her. He glanced at Esther. But someone else has been keeping her memory alive for you, hasn't she? Catherine nodded, looking at Esther with affection. Esther tells me stories about Mom all the time. About how she used to sing in the kitchen, and how she would read to me for hours when I was little, and how she fought to get her foundation started when everyone said it wouldn't work. Richard felt a pang of both gratitude and regret. Gratitude that Esther had given his daughter what he couldn't, and regret that he had failed them both so completely. Mr. Harrington, Esther said, her voice gentle but firm, I think you and Catherine need some time together, and I could use some time alone if you don't mind. Richard nodded. Of course. Take the rest of the day and tomorrow as well. With pay, he added quickly. It's the least I can do. That's not necessary, Esther began. It is, Richard insisted. Please, Esther, and know that this conversation isn't over. I have a lot more to say to you, to apologize for, to make right. Esther considered this, then nodded. Tomorrow, then, after you've had time to think, and after you've spent some time with your daughter. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Catherine. Those earrings would have suited you perfectly today. Your mother would have been proud. With that, she left father and daughter alone in the grand hall, the weight of the morning's events settling around them like dust after a storm. Dad, Catherine said after a moment. What happens now? Richard looked down at the velvet pouch in his hand, then at his daughter's face, so like Eleanor's, so full of questions he hadn't been willing to answer. Now, he said, we talk. Really talk. About your mother, about the foundation, about your presentation today. He hesitated, then added, and then we need to talk about what happened this morning, and why, and what it says about me. About us. Catherine nodded, understanding the gravity of what had transpired. And Esther? What about her? Richard sighed, feeling the full weight of his actions. That, he said, is going to take more than just talk to make right. As they walked together toward his study, Richard knew that the next few hours would be just the beginning of a much longer, much more difficult journey, one that would force him to confront true is about himself that he had never been brave enough to face before. The grandfather clock in Richard's study chimed 3 times, marking the hours that had passed since he and Catherine had closed the heavy oak door behind them. The leather chairs that had once felt so imposing to a young Catherine now held father and daughter like old friends, witnesses to a conversation long overdue. I had no idea she kept all these, Catherine said, gently touching the photo album open on her lap. The pages were filled with snapshots of Eleanor Harrington, not the polished society photos that appeared in charity newsletters, but intimate family moments captured over years. Neither did I, Richard admitted. Esther must have collected them after your mother passed. He leaned over to look at a photo of Eleanor laughing on a beach, her hair wild in the wind. I remember that day. You were building sandcastles and your mother kept pretending a wave was coming to wash them away. You were so determined to protect them. Catherine smiled at the memory. I was 7, and I thought I could hold back the ocean with a plastic shovel. Your mother said it was the perfect metaphor for life. Building something beautiful, knowing it won't last forever, but building it anyway. Richard's voice caught slightly. She was wise that way. They had spent hours talking about Eleanor, sharing memories that had been locked away for too long. Catherine had shown Richard her presentation slides, explaining how her mother's foundation had grown since her death, continuing the work Eleanor had been passionate about. I wish I'd been there to see your presentation, Richard said. How did it go? Catherine's expression brightened. Really well. Professor Chen said it was the most comprehensive analysis in the class. She hesitated. I actually recorded it. Would you want to watch it sometime? I'd like that very much, Richard said sincerely. A comfortable silence fell between them, both aware that they had circled around the elephant in the room long enough. It was Catherine who finally addressed it. Dad, about what happened with Esther? Richard's face grew solemn. Yes, that's something we need to discuss. Why did you suspect her so quickly? Catherine asked directly. Was it really just because she works for us, or was it... She trailed off, not wanting to accuse her father outright. Richard took a deep breath. It was both, and that's the ugly truth I've been avoiding all day. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens where Esther had often walked with Eleanor during her final months. When something went missing, my mind immediately went to the person who had the least, who might have reason to want more. But I have to ask myself, if Thomas had been in my room, would I have suspected him just as quickly? Catherine waited, already knowing the answer. No, Richard admitted. I wouldn't have. And that forces me to confront something about myself that I'm not proud of. He turned back to his daughter. I've always considered myself fair-minded. I donate to the right causes. I have diversity initiatives at all my companies. I say all the right things. But when it actually mattered, when it came down to a real moment of trust, I revealed my true biases. People can change, Dad, Catherine said softly. Mom always believed that. Your mother was better than me in so many ways, Richard acknowledged with a sad smile. She would be deeply disappointed in how I treated Esther today. So what are you going to do about it? Catherine challenged. A simple apology isn't going to fix this, Richard nodded. You're right. This requires more than words. He walked back to his desk and sat down, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. Esther has given 15 years to this family. She cared for your mother when she was dying. She's been there for you when I wasn't. And today, I repaid all of that by treating her as if she were nothing more than a stereotype. That's a good start. Recognizing what happened, Catherine encouraged. But recognition isn't enough. Richard looked at his daughter with new appreciation. When had she become so wise? What would you suggest? Catherine thought for a moment. First, a public apology. The accusation was public, so the apology should be too. Everyone on staff needs to hear it. Agreed, Richard said, making a note on a pad. What else? You need to listen to her, Dad, really listen. Not just about what happened today, but about her experiences working here all these years. There might be other things you've missed. Richard winced but nodded. You're right. Anything else? Catherine hesitated, then spoke carefully. I think you should look at how you run this household. The pay, the benefits, the working conditions. Mom always said the staff here was family, but do we treat them that way? Really treat them that way? Richard felt a surge of pride through his shame. His daughter had clearly inherited Eleanor's compassion along with her features. All excellent points. I'll start working on this right away. He glanced at his watch. It's getting late. Esther will be back tomorrow, and I want to be prepared. Will you tell me how it goes? Catherine asked, rising from her chair. I will, Richard promised. And Catherine, thank you for the talk about your mother and for helping me see clearly. Catherine smiled and left her father to his thoughts. The next morning, Richard gathered the entire household staff in the main hall once again. They stood in a tense semicircle, whispering among themselves until Richard cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. I've asked you here because I owe Mrs. Williams an apology, and I want you all to hear it. He looked toward the doorway where Esther stood, her posture as dignified as always, though there were new shadows beneath her eyes suggesting a sleepless night. Esther, please. Richard gestured to a spot beside him, slowly. Esther crossed the hall to stand near Richard, maintaining a respectful distance. Yesterday, Richard began, addressing the assembled staff, I accused Mrs. Williams of stealing my late wife's diamond earrings. I did so without proper evidence, jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information. He paused, forcing himself to be completely honest. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. I jumped to conclusions based on my own biases and prejudices. Murmurs rippled through the staff. Richard raised a hand to quiet them. As you all now know, Mrs. Williams did nothing wrong. In fact, she acted with integrity, as she has every day of the 15 years she's worked in this house. It was my own daughter who took the earrings with no intention of stealing them, but without asking permission. Richard turned to face Esther directly now. Mrs. Williams, Esther, I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you yesterday. My actions were inexcusable and revealed unfair biases that I was not even aware I held. I judged you based on harmful stereotypes rather than on your character and your years of loyal service to my family. Esther's expression remained carefully composed, though something flickered in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement of his effort. I know that words alone cannot make up for my actions, Richard continued. Trust once broken cannot be instantly repaired. But I want you and everyone here to know that I am committed to doing better. To being better. He turned back to address the entire staff. Moving forward, there will be changes in how this household operates. I've taken too much for granted for too long, and it's time for that to change. The staff exchanged curious glances. First, there will be a comprehensive review of wages and benefits for all staff members, to ensure everyone is being compensated fairly for their hard work. This announcement was met with surprised looks and a few cautious smiles. Second, I will be establishing an education fund for staff members and their families who wish to pursue further education or vocational training. More whispers, more surprised expressions, and third, Richard said, I will be instituting a new policy of open communication, monthly meetings where any concerns can be raised without fear of repercussion. This household runs because of all of you, and your voices deserve to be heard. He turned back to Esther. Mrs. Williams has agreed to help oversee these changes to ensure they truly meet the needs of the staff. Esther nodded once, confirming this arrangement. Mr. Harrington and I had a long conversation this morning, she explained to her colleagues. These changes are a beginning, not an end. Exactly, Richard agreed. A beginning. He looked around at the faces of the people who kept his home running, people whose names he sometimes struggled to remember, whose lives remained largely a mystery to him. That would change too, he resolved silently. That's all for now, he concluded. Thank you for your time. As the staff dispersed, many of them stopping to speak quietly with Esther, Richard stood awkwardly to the side, aware that he had taken only the first small step on a long road. Thomas approached him hesitantly. Sir, if I might say something? Of course, Thomas, Richard said. What you did just now, it took courage. Not many men in your position would acknowledge their mistakes so openly. Richard shook his head. It shouldn't take courage to do the right thing, Thomas. It should just be what we do. He watched as Esther received a gentle hug from Maria. Besides, this is just the beginning of making things right. Thomas nodded and moved away, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. Across the room, Esther looked up and met his gaze. There was still hurt there, still caution, but something else too. Oh, perhaps a willingness to see where this new beginning might lead. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a chance, and that was more than Richard had dared to hope for. 6 months had passed since the day of the diamond earrings. The Grand Harrington estate looked much the same from the outside. Manicured lawns, stately columns, imposing iron gates, but inside, subtle yet profound changes had taken root and begun to flourish. The east wing of the mansion, once reserved exclusively for the family, now housed a small but well-equipped classroom where staff members could take courses in everything from financial literacy to college preparation. Down the hall, a former storage room had been transformed into a bright nursery where employees could bring their children on days when regular childcare fell through. In the main hall, where Richard had once publicly accused Esther of theft, a large bulletin board displayed photographs of staff members and their families. Alongside community announcements and congratulatory notes for recent achievements, a nursing degree earned, a child's graduation, a new grandchild welcomed into the world. Richard Harrington sat in his study, reviewing quarterly reports from Eleanor's foundation, which he had taken a much more active role in over the past months. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Come in, he called. Esther entered carrying a silver tray with tea. Their interactions had slowly evolved from the tense, careful exchanges of those first weeks after the incident to something approaching their old ease, though both knew their relationship would never be quite the same. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I thought you might need this, Esther said, setting down the tray. You've been at those reports for hours. Richard smiled gratefully. Thank you. I'm discovering that my late wife's foundation is far more complex than I ever appreciated. She built something remarkable. She certainly did, Esther agreed. She hesitated, then added, The board meeting is tomorrow? Yes, and I'm nervous if you want the truth. Richard chuckled self-deprecatingly. I've run billion-dollar companies, but presenting Eleanor's vision to her board has me feeling like a first-year associate again. You'll do fine, Esther assured him. You've put in the work to understand what she was trying to build. Richard nodded, appreciating her confidence. That reminds me. How's the staff committee coming along with the benefit proposals? After the incident, Richard had established a committee of staff members, chaired by Esther, to review and suggest improvements to working conditions, benefits, and household policies. We've finalized our recommendations, Esther said. I've left the report on your desk. The healthcare extension to part-time staff is the priority for most, followed by the retirement matching. I'll review it this evening, Richard promised. And Esther, thank you for leading this. I know it wasn't easy to get everyone to speak frankly at first. Esther's smile was measured but genuine. People are beginning to believe that real change is possible here, that their voices matter. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and closing, followed by quick footsteps in the hall. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the crisp autumn air. Dad. Esther, I got it, she exclaimed, waving an envelope. I got the internship at the foundation. Richard rose from his chair, beaming. That's wonderful news. Congratulations, dear, Esther said warmly. Though I never doubted you for a moment. Catherine rushed into the study, hugging her father and then Esther. They said my presentation on Mom's vision for community-centered philanthropy really impressed them. I can't wait to get started. Your mother would be so proud, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just of the internship, but of the young woman you've become. Catherine's expression softened. I've had good examples, she said, looking between her father and Esther. Both of you. Richard felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. 6 months ago, he had been sleepwalking through life, buried in work, disconnected from his daughter and blind to his own prejudices. It had taken a painful incident, one he still felt ashamed of, to wake him up. We should celebrate, he said. Dinner tonight? I'll have Thomas make reservations at Le Jardin. Catherine shook her head. Actually, I was thinking we could do something different. Tonight is the community dinner at Mrs. Williams' church. I thought maybe we could go. If that's okay with you, Esther. Richard looked at Esther in surprise. In 15 years, he had never once attended any event in her community. Esther hesitated. It's nothing fancy. Just a potluck dinner the church holds each month. Everyone brings a dish to share. It sounds wonderful, Richard said sincerely. We'd be honored to attend if we'd be welcome. You would, Esther assured him after a moment's consideration. Though people might be surprised to see you there. I've been causing a lot of surprise these past few months, Richard said with a rueful smile. One more won't hurt. Later that evening, Richard found himself in the community hall of a small Baptist church 15 miles from his estate. The room was filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation and soul music playing softly in the background. Long tables covered with checkered cloths were laden with home-cooked dishes, fried chicken, collard greens, mac and cheese, sweet potato pies, and countless other offerings. Richard and Catherine had brought a store-bought cake, which had been accepted with polite thanks, though Richard couldn't help noticing it remained largely untouched amid the homemade delicacies. Next time, we should try to make something, Catherine whispered to him, noticing the same thing. You mean Esther should try to make something and let us take credit, Richard whispered back, making his daughter laugh. Esther had introduced them to what seemed like dozens of people, her family members, church friends, neighbors. Richard had met her grandchildren for the first time, twin boys of 10 who were fascinated by his electric car, and her sister Dorothy, whose warmth reminded him of Esther herself. Now, Richard found himself sitting at a table with Esther's brother-in-law, Paul, a retired mechanic who was telling him about the classic car he was restoring. It's a '67 Mustang, Paul explained, his eyes lighting up. Found it in a barn, if you can believe it. Engine was shot, interior was a mess, but the body was solid. Been working on it for 2 years now. Richard leaned forward, genuinely interested. My father had a '65, taught me to drive in that car. What color is yours? As the two men fell into easy conversation about carburetors and chrome details, Richard caught sight of Esther across the room, watching him with a thoughtful expression. When their eyes met, she gave him a small nod of approval. Later, As the evening wound down, Richard found himself helping to stack chairs alongside Esther's grandson. "Your grandma's worked for my family for a long time," Richard said to the boy. The child nodded solemnly. "She says you're different now, that you're trying to be better." Richard was taken aback by the directness. "I am trying," he admitted. "I made mistakes, big ones. But I'm learning." "Grandma says that's all anyone can ask for," the boy replied with the simple wisdom of children. Trying and learning. As they prepared to leave, Esther approached Richard while Catherine was saying goodbye to some new friends she'd made. "Thank you for coming tonight," Esther said quietly. "It meant a lot to my family." "Thank you for including us," Richard replied. "It's been eye-opening." He hesitated, then added, "Esther, I know these past months haven't erased what happened. I'm not sure anything could. But I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to help me learn and do better." Esther studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Harrington, Richard, I've worked for your family for almost 16 years now. In all that time I knew who you were, but you never really knew me. My family, my community, my life outside your home, these were invisible to you." Richard nodded, accepting the truth of her words. "What happened with those earrings was painful," Esther continued. "But sometimes pain can be a teacher if we let it. I think you've been willing to learn from it, and that's why I stayed." "I'm grateful that you did," Richard said sincerely. "The work isn't finished," Esther reminded him. "Not in your home, and certainly not in the world outside it." "I know," Richard acknowledged. "But it started, and I won't go back to being the man I was before." Catherine joined them then, her eyes bright with excitement about new friendships formed and perspectives gained. As they walked to the car together, Richard felt a sense of cautious hope. The journey ahead would be long and at times difficult, but for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, he felt he might be on the right path. The diamond earrings that had sparked this transformation now sat in a special display case in Catherine's room, alongside a photograph of Eleanor. They were no longer just valuable jewelry, but a reminder of how quickly assumptions can be made, how easily privilege can blind, and how much work it takes to truly see the people right in front of you. It was a lesson Richard Harrington was determined never to forget.